welcome to the first ever episode of the Sussex Strategy Group Cannabis Update. I'm Michael Edwards, Creative Director and Digital Director here at Sussex Strategy Group, and I'm joined by my colleague Brian Zeiler-Kligman, Senior Associate. Brian, welcome.
Thank you.
So we're really excited to be bringing this new show to you today to keep you up to date and informed and give you some perspective on what's going on as it pertains to cannabis and specifically the retail cannabis space here in Ontario and across the country. Let's just get right into it. Let's talk a little bit about what's our vision for this show going forward. Brian.
Well, there's certainly an opportunity to provide a number of budding insights into what's going on, as well as really bad puns.
And we're going to keep those to a minimum here today, right?
Yeah. Okay. Indeed. But ultimately, really, we work in the public policy space, we work in the political space, and frankly, this is the largest thing to happen in our lifetimes on that basis. And as we'll get into a little bit on this, the impacts on not just those who are directly in the cannabis space, but everyone, because of whether it's your employees, whether it's your transport companies, whether it's your caretakers, maintenance staff, so forth, there's going to be some impact. And so whether it's the government regulation of this, the government rules around when and where cannabis can be consumed, all of this is going to affect everyone, and so it really is important that everyone is aware of what's taking place.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this so interesting, right? You talk to anyone, and they have an opinion, or they know a guy, or they're involved directly, and you wouldn't imagine some way, shape, or form in something that is being touched upon by the new legislation and cannabis, right? And to your point, it's not just about licensed producers. Those are obviously an important role in this, and as a firm, we've helped quite a few through the process, but it's about that broader what's next. And I think it's really exciting because the question is, what is next, right? Like, how does this impact your industry, even if you're not directly in this space? And I think that's the point of our show here, is we want to kind of focus that. Everyone's an expert in cannabis these days, but we want to tell stories and we want to get the actual experts on to join us and give perspective. So we're going to be looking outward to partners. We're going to be looking to professionals in the industry and in industries surrounding cannabis so that we can bring you perspective. And I think that this is something that we've done in our shows in the past. We did it in the lead up to the Ontario provincial election. And now we're looking to say, you know what, we can do this in this space as well. We want to do that for you. We want to do that for our client and for our viewer.
Well, and certainly, as you already alluded to, we've been in the space, and we've helped we've helped a number of clients already, whether it is obtaining that approval for the LP licenses from Health Canada, whether it's been dealing with the provincial governments in terms of the various regulatory regimes that are out there, or now with Ontario and looking at that retail landscape and what is that going to mean. We've been in all of those places, and so we've already helped a number of clients. We recognize that there's a lot of people out there who have questions about this, and so we're looking to make sure that we can provide that insight.
Yeah, and as a firm, I think we're really excited to kind of announce this cannabis advisory. So you see on the screen behind us right there, advisory, and this is really what it's all about for us, right? It's taking the thinking that we're known for and the expertise that we bring to the table at all three levels of government and in the strategic communications space, and saying, how do we look at these issues holistically, right? So moving just beyond, federal regulation, moving just beyond, the process of becoming an LP, but thinking about that next wave of, what is the edibles space going to look like? How is retail unfolding municipality by municipality? And how do we bring that integrated approach in a way that makes sense for clients, existing and future clients, if you're out there watching us here. So this episode today, we're just going to kind of dip our toes in a little bit, talk about some things that we're seeing and that are on our radar ahead of October 17th, 10/17. I think that'll be the new 420 maybe, at least here in Canada. And kind of just give you a rundown. So we're going to be talking about, Brian, the Ontario retail space,
yes.
An update there, a little conversation about the broader industry, broader impact, and then 5 things to watch. So we're going to have a list of 5 things to watch, and we'll run those down and we'll see how close we are when we take a look back in a month from now if we hit the mark or not.
Important to have a little clickbait.
Yes. So tell me, give me an update, Brian. Tell us a little bit about the retail landscape in Ontario and how that's unfolding. Obviously, Doug Ford, big shakeup there. What's going on?
Well, that was kind of the worst kept secret, I guess, coming out of the election in Ontario, that there was going to be a shakeup with respect to the retail of cannabis in Ontario. So initially, as everyone probably was familiar with, there is still an LCBO subsidiary called the Ontario Cannabis Retail Corporation, but all sales of recreational adult use cannabis in Ontario was going to take place through this entity. So effectively, it was called the Ontario Cannabis Stores, but effectively the LCBO of cannabis model here in Ontario. And then Doug Ford's government brought that complete 180 of going from public retail to private retail on the pot side. Now, the other side of this is that in announcing that, the government also indicated that municipalities would have a fairly strong say in what was going to take place with all of this. So beyond the regular components, as we often deal with on the municipal side, about whether there's bylaws allowing such types of businesses or what the zoning regulations are for those, there is also still an as yet undefined deadline, but that municipalities will be given the opportunity to actually opt out of private retail of cannabis so that they can actually say, prior to this April 1st, 2019 timeline, when private retail bricks and mortar stores are expected to be opening up in Ontario, to say, not in my municipality.
Yeah, and it seems to me undefined is kind of a theme that has been running through this space. And, I think for years.
A little hazy, perhaps?
Yeah, a little. But, undefined is a little bit nerve-wracking when we're moving so close to October 17th. So, and we'll get into it a little bit more, but looking beyond just flower products, but looking at edibles, looking at tinctures and all these things, undefined. Looking at advertising rules and regs there and what you can and can't do and who can run ads and who can't and what the scope really is of marketing for these brands, undefined, right? We're looking at just a whole host of things. Where can you put a retail store? How can you apply for a license? What is the cost of that? Is there going to be taxation at the municipal level? All of that undefined. So I feel like at all levels of government, there's this imperative to sort a lot out really, really quickly.
There is, and just in terms of that undefined part, on the Ontario side, keeping with that update that we're doing, we do know that there is going to be greater clarity coming. One of which is, originally the legislature was supposed to be coming back September 24th, and we were expecting that legislation to put in place this new private retail model was going to actually be introduced on that date, to have it passed by October 17th. And that would also have then at least probably set out when the municipalities opt-out deadline was going to be. It's probably still going to be around September 24th, but just given what's happening with the legislature and timing, we're not 100% certain.
Well, I'm sure we can always just slap a notwithstanding clause on it and meet some deadlines.
Meet some deadlines there, unless someone rings bells. But in any event, or presents a reasoned amendment. But ultimately, that legislation in Ontario, it is going to be coming out, but it's only just going to define sort of the framework of the retail space, which is what we already mostly know. Yeah. The real big details in terms of like operating parameters, whether there's going to be restrictions in terms of minimum distance from schools or hospitals or things of that sort, those are still going to be set out in regulations. Yeah. And so those will still be to come between now and April 1st, as well as things like how many licenses is a particular company going to be able to acquire? Are they going to auction those licenses? Yeah. Those sorts of things will still come.
Undefined, but I guess TBD. We'll see what happens there. What I think is interesting, obviously my background is in digital, and I find it kind of very fascinating that as much as there is still to be determined, it seems as if the government of Ontario came out and made some determination as it pertains to e-commerce in this space, right? So when we're talking about retail, you have your physical retail and there's going to be licensing and all the things that we just talked about in terms of how that rolls out. We'll have to wait and see. But when it comes to online sales, that is actually going to be managed through the OCS. And I'm curious to get your thoughts, Brian, on why that might be, why this government feels online sales, which is, 99.9, if not 100% of the market as it exists currently.
Well, legally.
Legally, is something that can be done and should only be done by the province. And do we foresee opportunity for that to change?
Yeah, I think there's definitely opportunity for it to change. Certainly one of the elements that was necessary was that there would be an outlet for the public to be able to acquire cannabis post October 17th in a legal fashion, not from their black market sources. And so the Ontario Cannabis Store, which the structure is already in place, a lot of the infrastructure is there, that was a viable solution.
Makes sense.
Also gives a certain amount of control over the product at that time. Whether or not we're going to get into a situation, though, post October 17th, around April 1st, 2019 or before then, where, say, an LP is able to provide the storefront and then the OCS provides the back office of actual sales or so forth, or something even, further removed than that, that's still going to be determined, but certainly the current trajectory is just the OCS.
Gotcha. Yeah. That makes sense. And I think that's kind of a good place to bring this to a conversation about the broader industry, right? When we talk about retail, that doesn't mean necessarily that you need to be a licensed producer to get into the retail game.
No, definitely
and
not.
You don't need to be a licensed producer to get into a lot of these areas and these, new businesses and new business opportunities that are formulating as a result of legalization. And it also makes me think a little bit about the broader impact on other industries. I know off camera we were chatting a little bit. We were talking about what's the impact? What are the responsibilities for employers? How is this going to affect or change existing industries and existing businesses? And how are Canadians and how are Ontarians looking at this and saying, okay, well, this is happening now. This is something that my employees are, consuming or partaking in, and now I have obligations in this space as well. So why don't we start with the broader industry? How do you see that unfolding? We have Constellation Brands that's invested quite heavily in canopy growth, and no shock there that, big alcohol and, to a degree, pharma. There's a pharma interest in this space as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how those two very different industries that suddenly have overlap are going to be kind of competing and bringing different perspective. But yeah, I'd be curious to know, what's that broader industry looking like?
It's, that's really where some of the really fascinating parts of how this is going to unfold are going to play out, because there's going to be licensed producers, and there's going to be licensed producers that make money, and then there's going to be licensed producers that disappear. There's going to be all sorts of ancillary industries that service this. And then you're also going to get into specialized components of, already we've got cannabis companies who are engaged in technology plays. We've got cannabis companies that are engaged in big data plays, because there hasn't been research on cannabis up until now. So a lot of this has been crowdsourced. We've got all sorts of different pieces. We've even got, there's going to be discussions about how does this, in terms of cannabis, how does this deal with optimal aging? How does this deal with, well, as you got into the HR components, Secret Santas or holiday parties or other things that companies do? How are they going to be able to deal with? No one necessarily bats an eye when someone pulls out a bottle of wine for a company function, but if it's I'm not going to say brownies, because that's still going to be illegal after October 17th, but if someone brings out a joint, how is that going to be handled? Obviously, there's restrictions around where this can be consumed, so there's still some concerns there from a legal perspective for the companies, but there are certainly concerns as well, even just having people go on the floor at, say, a factory if they've taken something at lunch. How's that going to affect not just them, but their colleagues?
For sure.
So how do you detect these things? How do you make sure that everyone is still safe on the job?
So if you're a lawyer in this space or an HR consultant, you're probably doing pretty well with this big change right now.
Oh yeah, it's hard to find a law firm that does not have a cannabis practice at
Hard
this
to
point.
find a government relations firm that doesn't have a cannabis practice.
Yeah, touche.
Yeah. Okay, great. And broader impact, I mean, for me, I'm most excited to see all of these new innovative companies that pop up and see how the market responds. And this is what I think is so fascinating here, is we don't know how the consumer is going to react yet. And I have not spoken to anyone or seen anything that's concrete that can say, well, consumer behavior is going to be X. I think the most certain thing we know is there's probably going to be more demand than there is supply.
Yeah.
And so we'll see what access looks like. We'll see what preferences look like. We'll see if consumers are really, really interested in specific brands the way they are with, your favorite drink or what have you. I'm very curious to see that broader impact and how that proliferates and how that impacts our society. It'll be interesting. So,
Well, even with that, we're going to start getting into these products that kind of blend blend exactly what the market is. So
Totally.
Already you've got topical treatments that are infused with CBD, and so they're kind of like an Rub A535 but with CBD in them. So should that be medicinal cannabis? Should that be recreational cannabis? Is it a natural health product? Where do you sell it? How can it be dealt with?
Yeah.
So all of these are different components that are going to come with this, and then you start, as you said, with the alcohol. Nova Scotia is the only jurisdiction in the world that's allowed cannabis and alcohol to mix in the same store. Now you've got the potential of the same beverage where this mixes. How is that going to play out? So there's a lot still to be determined.
I almost feel like, we have a lot of topics, and this isn't going to be our only show, but I feel like we could talk about this stuff pretty much all day. There's just no shortage of things to kind of cover and think about. Having given that, we have 5 things that we want to focus on. So we're going to do 5 today. We're going to run down. And let's start off with number 1. So number 1, Brian, government, PSAs, public education, and marketing restrictions. Where do you see this shaking up? I know Canadian government's allocated, I think, maybe $200 or $250 million, something like that. Don't remember the exact number, for awareness and advertising. And I think the perspective from government is they want to be that kind of source of information and exposure to the public so that to a degree they can control it. And what I find very interesting is the approach that this Liberal government has taken is, yes, they are shifting from the medicinal space to now this public, this legalized retail space. But the language that they use and the approach they use, I find, is always still very, we're doing this, but we're not endorsing this behavior. And so will that tone filter into education and awareness? And what level, who's going to be the source of information for the senior who's heard about CBD and is thinking about dosing and has absolutely no idea? How do you see that unfolding?
Well, there's a variety of ways in which it's going to unfold. One of which is we know that the federal funding is already flowing to a number of different organizations, like MAD Canada and other relevant stakeholders so that they can undertake some of this education. We also know that from an LP perspective, that's one of the areas that they're actually engaging in terms of trying to educate the consumer, just because they recognize they're going to be dealing with a lot of people who are kind of interested. They're interested in the novelty, maybe want to try this out or haven't experienced it in many, many years and don't know what exactly to do. So a lot of them are going to go to the Auroras, the Canopies, the Biomes, and so forth, and try to understand what exactly is there, and that's where the education is going to come in. However, as you said, there is this narrative that has a bit of an underlying, not condoning, but we're sanctioning kind of tone to it, and so that is going to play out. But you're going to see different messaging coming from different sources. Obviously, the LPs are not going to take that same tone. So that's going to be interesting, as well as you've pointed out. The marketing component.
Yeah.
It's very confusing. what can and can't be and who can carry it.
This is totally true. But I think in the next couple of weeks, we should be having a greater understanding and more clarity from the government
Hopefully.
on that. So hopefully,
Hopefully.
It'll go into the defined column and not the undefined column.
Yeah.
Number 2, the changing narrative. So we're getting closer. Things are changing. What's the narrative looking like right now in terms of the public conversation that we're having when it comes to cannabis?
Well, part of this is we were dealing in a hypothetical for a long time, and now we're going to be dealing in a reality. And it's interesting to sort of see that as this comes into, not only as it comes into being a legal industry, but as it becomes a more entrenched legal industry, you're going to start seeing this becoming, like all other industries. And so the same factors and issues that are facing other companies in terms of reputation and in terms of expectations of the public, so forth, they're going to start playing upon these licensed producers as well as others in the cannabis space a fair bit as well. And so, we've dealt with here in a variety of different guises in terms of reputation management for companies. I previously worked in the beer industry and was working on their corporate social responsibility component and environmental sustainability.
Yeah.
It's only cannabis is an intensive product to create, so it requires lights, it requires water at an intensive level. There's going to start to be more stories about that. There's going to start to be more scrutiny about that. So you're going to start seeing, you're already starting to see, but you're going to start to see even more the transition away from everything being about Cheech and Chong and that sort of, lots of smoke, everyone high as a kite perspective to being an actual business. I again, with my background in the beer industry, there was the suspicion by folks, or the joke by folks, that we were drunk all the time.
Yeah.
But amazingly, that still managed to be a multi-billion-dollar industry in the country. And so, similarly with these cannabis companies, yeah, maybe there's going to be jokes about the fact that, oh, haha, you work in cannabis, but they're also serious business people.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly to that. One thing I've noticed is I think when people from the outside looking in, when you think of Canadian cannabis right now, you're really thinking of professionalism, right? And I think we're recognized internationally at the moment for, having rigorous standards, for having this intensive regulatory process, for having started from, the very beginning, I forget what year, let's say 7, 8, 9 years, whatever it's been building up to this, of incrementally moving the goalpost toward legalization. And there's that maturity, even in companies that, haven't sold a product yet. They're 6, 7, 8 years old, right? With multiple billions of dollars of market cap. And they've built systems. They're attracting good talent from outside industries, people who maybe aren't, smokers or users of cannabis products, but very interested in seeing where can this go for these companies, but also for this industry as Canada kind of looks outward to the world and the rest of the world starts to look in. So I think that narrative is an important one too that we'll be following.
For sure.
Number 3, municipal elections. So these are a big deal, and they're a big deal for the reason, correct me if I'm wrong, that the municipalities get to make a decision on whether or not they're going to have retail cannabis in their municipality. And a city like Toronto, I don't think this will happen, but if people vote against it, could you imagine not having retail in the province's capital, the largest city in Canada? It would be a little crazy.
Well, it's going to be very interesting. The municipal elections here in Ontario, they take place October 22nd, just 5 days after the legalization date. And, we've already had a number of municipalities, Oakville, Richmond Hill, Markham, Perth just recently indicated that they're probably going to opt out as well, who, interestingly, kind of on the periphery of the major cities in Ontario, but still close to. And certainly would be markets that people would be very interested in servicing as retailers, potentially shutting themselves off. And it will be interesting to see if that becomes an election issue in some of these places.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It's almost like a little mini review of where the cannabis support was coming from at the federal level and when people were voting federally last election, right? I mean, if you're a strong no, if you come out and you're campaigning on that in a smaller municipality, or a suburb to a larger city, or a rural area where maybe it doesn't make sense for whatever reason, you're seeing the preferences, I think, of those municipalities and their voters kind of shine through in the positions that are being taken. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to see, because I do think in Ontario, at least speaking for Ontario, if we have, this thriving retail experience, Oakville might be a no today, but in 2 years from now, Oakville might be a yes, because it would be like, not having Starbucks or not having the LCBO in Oakville. That would be a little bit crazy, right? So we'll see how the preferences evolve, and I think maybe that's one of the ways to informally track that, is how are the municipalities responding to the industry, and how are they kind of growing and moving along with it. Edibles consultation is number 4. So you might not know this, but on day 1, edibles are a no-go, right? You can't, no special brownies, I guess, unless people are making them themselves.
Yeah.
But a lot of the cool things that we see and that are kind of out there in the narrative about, the future of cannabis, you talk to almost anyone, oh, it's in oils and tinctures, it's not in smoking, it's in edibles, it's in dosing, it's in microdosing. The majority of those things aren't actually going to be here. So the future, if you will, isn't going to be arriving on October 17th.
In a way it will, and in a way it won't, in that, yes, you're right. I think where a lot of the public is actually most interested, things like vaping, things like edibles, they're not there on October 17th. And it's been interesting sort of seeing within the industry, there are some who think that this is quite sensible by the government, that they've taken kind of a go slow approach on it, because even with edibles, they affect people in significantly different ways than if you inhale the product, and the dosaging component is often difficult to be quite precise on. So needing to get a regime around that, we've already seen that in other U.S. jurisdictions where edibles have been allowed from the start, where there's been some issues. So it'll be interesting, but the big piece is that we've had sort of this game of Frogger on the government relations side, where you've had
very much so.
It's been
Luckily,
the federal.
Frogger hasn't been run over, though, right?
Not yet. But there can be that regulatory backlash. But ultimately, where it went from focusing on Health Canada and the federal government down to the provinces, now that the rules are set, and it's going to be, as soon as legalization takes place, back up to the federal government, because it's the federal government that's going to set the regulatory regime for edibles and these other products that we know not only is where the market wants to go, it's where the licensed producers want to go, because that's where the better margins are and where they can distinguish themselves from the black market.
Makes sense, yeah. And well, we're going to have a whole nother episode on the black market, but I think that's something to be looking out for too. I think that's a big part of this, is doing it right means having a legitimate market that doesn't have to compete with an illegitimate market. And so the effects of that, I think supply is really going to be a driver, and price as well. But seeing how that rolls out is something that remains to be seen, but very, very interesting for us and for our clients. We're on the last one of the 5 things to watch. So this one, we're filming this with a big news story today, with the kind of announcement of, the United States having an even stronger stance on cannabis, and Canadian cannabis in particular. U.S. impact and interest. How do we see that? How do you see that today kind of unfolding? Do you see, there's a few ways to approach this. I think we couldn't have this show without talking about the border issue. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But also talking about a mature multi-billion-dollar industry with big companies. Constellation is the one that gets thrown around quite a bit, invested in this. And there will be a host of others that come on board, I'm sure, and have very deep interests. How long is this uniquely Canadian industry going to remain Canadian and uniquely Canadian? What are you seeing there?
Well, so we'll start with the border.
Let's start there. Okay.
Because ultimately, by making this video and working for our clients, we could be putting ourselves at jeopardy. of ever going back to the United States, as apparently is the case. But that we've had
When
this.
you took this job, did you sign up thinking you'd be a cannabis maverick?
I was not expecting that, nor was I expecting I would be on the FBI's most wanted list.
Yeah.
So yeah,
We're not doing this one live today, so there might be some edits to this final episode.
But ultimately, you know, it's really interesting. You've got 9 states in the U.S. plus the District of Columbia, you know, Washington D.C., where it's legal, whether it's recreational or medicinal or a combination. So you've got companies there, but we've also had these stories within the cannabis industry in the United States where they can't bank. They're operating in cash only and so forth. Whereas here in Canada, as you said, it's been this mature industry. We've got we've got institutional funds investing in them. We've got well-established companies investing in these licensed producers and so forth. It's a mature industry. And so these companies are now going to Europe, they're going to Jamaica, they're going to Colombia, they're going to Israel, other places where there's a marketplace for them. Some have even listed on the New York Stock Exchange, but you know, we're suddenly seeing this weird situation with the U.S. where some people might even say that there's a protectionist play and the potential for having the U.S. Kind of protecting its own, even if it's backhanded, to prevent the Canadian companies from growing big enough to dominate this
There
space.
could also be a little bit of NAFTA leverage amongst other things there, and I think that we'll see in a few months from now. I mean, whatever happens with NAFTA, what position the United States takes on cannabis and Canadian cannabis could change a little bit. But
also interesting to see what our tourism dollars look like from the United States.
Well, that's the thing. Maybe we'll have a huge influx in tourism, and who knows what that is going to look like. And I think it's largely undefined. There's no one sitting there thinking about, municipalities right now going back to retail, thinking about, okay, do we want to sell product? Not thinking about how can we have cannabis tourism in the city of Toronto to boost small businesses. But one day, that's a conversation that municipal governments will be having, and people in the industry, retail, production, what have you, will be looking forward to having with them, right? But I think for me, I'm really curious. You talked about internationally, these companies looking internationally. How long is product going to be grown here? When you put in the cost of, overhead, operating in Canada, looking at energy costs, something that I know we're following very closely as it pertains to agriculture in general, but specifically cannabis, very light intensive, right? So how are those things, if I'm a Canadian company, how long am I going to say, okay, well, I just need facilities in Canada. I'm going to start looking elsewhere and importing product, right? So the import-export in the Canadian versus international, I think will be very interesting. And it'll be interesting to see how long the United States is willing to kind of sit on the sidelines federally before they kind of say, okay, well, we're missing out on the action here. So my perspective is, in a lot of ways, we're kind of the guinea pig for the United States a little bit.
A little bit.
In this particular instance.
Yeah, in this
right?
particular instance. Given the strong moral discussions in the United States in opposition to this, it's probably not, you had Barack Obama in power for 8 years, and there still was the same level of that companies couldn't incorporate, companies couldn't use the banking system, so forth. So I'm not sure that there's necessarily going to be a turnaround in the United States and their business perspective on the industry, in a quick period of time. I can stand to be proven wrong, but ultimately, I think you're still going to see this kind of quasi-legal situation for many of those companies in the U.S., which gives our companies the chance to grow and thrive.
To really get that foothold. So that'll be interesting. So those are 5 things. A month from now, who knows where we'll be on those, but hopefully we'll have a little more definition. And thanks for watching. We're really excited to bring this to you. We'll bring this periodically to you. We're going to have some guests on in the future that I think you'll find really exciting. If you have any questions for us, myself, Michael, or Brian, please don't hesitate to give us a call, reach out via email. The team here, very happy to talk to you about all things pertaining to cannabis and how it impacts you and how it impacts your business. So we'll be back soon. Thanks for watching this first ever episode of the Cannabis Show. Take care.